Hello, everybody. Welcome to BeerSmith Podcast number 41. We got a great show for you today. We're talking a little bit more about growing hops. I have just one announcement, which, of course, BeerSmith 2.1 is out, and the new BeerSmith recipe site at beersmithrecipes.com. Recommend you visit both of those. Go to beersmith.com to download the new version of the software, or beersmithrecipes.com to access, I think there's several thousand recipes out there now for you to search, and got a nice search engine built into that site. Just type in a couple words and you'll be at your favorite recipes. And now, without further ado, let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Jason Perrault from Perrault Farms, which is a family-run business in the Yakima Valley. They were established in 1902, over 110 years ago. Jason's a fourth-generation hop grower. They specialize in both conventional and organically grown craft beer hops, including Simcoe, Summit, Anthem, Cascade, Palisade, Citra, and many others. Jason's also a hop breeder from Select Botanicals Group, a member of Hop Breeding Company, LLC, and today we're going to talk a little about hop varieties and also how our hops are grown and processed. Jason, it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
How you doing today?
Doing well. Enjoying some sunny weather.
Yeah, it's actually raining here, which is kind of ironic, I think. But but Jason, can you tell us a little bit about your family business out there in Yakima Valley?
Yeah, we're a vertically integrated hop operation. The farm, like you said, is we're fourth generation hop farmers here in Yakima, and we grow several hundred acres of both conventional and organic hops. As you mentioned, we specialize in several different hop varieties, and primarily we're focusing in on ones that we've developed ourselves, such as Simcoe, Autanum, Palisade, Citra, Mosaic, and others that have come out of either Select Botanicals Group or Hop Breeding Company. Right now, the farm is probably about 90% hops, but we also have some cherries and some pears to kind of round that out. And I guess that's about it. That's kind of the quick answer to that.
Well, thanks. What makes growing hops in the Pacific Northwest and especially the Yakima Valley so special? What's different about that particular area?
Well, you could actually get really technical with that, and the main reason that hops do as well as they do in this area is the day length. You'll find that most major hop producing regions are centered right around the 45th to 48th parallel, right around in there. And that's simply because they have the proper mix of day length at the long days at the right time to induce proper growth, and then followed by a shortening of the days, which induces flowering right at the right time, so we can maximize crop. But other than that, that kind of makes the Pacific Northwest itself optimal for growth. But the Yakima Valley in particular is optimal due to our arid, dry conditions. We're less prone to diseases such as powdery mildew and downy mildew than maybe some of the more humid regions where hops were traditionally grown, some of the more maritime climates that they were traditionally grown.
You still get a fair amount of rain, though, right?
Not in the Yakima Valley, no.
No, really?
No, we're considered high desert here. And so in the Yakima Valley, we only get 7 to 10 inches of precipitation a year. And it usually averages on the lower side of that, so closer to the 7-8 inches. That differs from areas such as the Willamette Valley in Oregon, which does get quite a bit more rainfall than we do. What we've been able to do is we compensate with irrigation. So we're able to irrigate and give the plant the water it needs right when it needs it.
Because hops need a fair amount of water, don't they?
They do. They take up a lot of water, and we apply that primarily through drip irrigation, so we get as efficient water usage as possible.
Now, you also grow organic hops. What's different about organic hops?
Yeah, organic hops are
a bit of a specialty market, but
certainly are a specialty market, and but they present several more challenges than we have with conventional. Obviously, your pest control toolbox is much more limited, and the tools that are there available to you, and by tools I'm talking sprays and other chemicals that you can use. They're not nearly as effective. They're just a single piece in the whole process. So we really need to take a much more integrated approach with regard to pest control and nutrient management, because you don't have those effective tools that you would have available to you on the conventional side. So it's not too much different than any other organic crop. It's just there is for example, mites and aphids in hops can be a very fast reproducing pest that if they get a foothold, they can be hard to control even on the conventional side if they're allowed to get too high in population. With the organics, it's just that much more critical because we don't have those tools. So you got to stay on top of things that much more.
So how do you control those pests? I mean, what are the...
Well, it's a combination of things. Ironically, with organic hops, we actually spray those more than we do conventional hops. So our sprayer's actually out there probably on at least a weekly basis, so on a 7-day rotation. But we're spraying a different kind of chemical. It's a softer chemical. Usually, it's plant oils derived from plants that we use. Yeah, more of a natural-based product that are, approved for organic usage. But then we also rely on the natural predator population. The whole idea is to spray chemicals that are soft, that will slow down the reproduction of your pests, your target pests, that are soft on your beneficial insects. And so we're constantly monitoring on a weekly basis not only our pest levels, but what we call our predator levels as well. We have several predatory mites. There's lacewings, ladybugs, Stepharis beetles. There's several different predators out there that we monitor, and hopefully, by using the right mix of sprays, we can bring their populations up. And as the pest levels rise, so does the predator levels, and they kind of keep a balance there, keep in check. It doesn't always work that way. You have to consider that the pests have a bit of an advantage from the standpoint that a hop field is a naturally, genetically, it's just a single genotype throughout the whole field. Theoretically, every single plant in there is genetically identical. So if a pest or disease is allowed to take off, it tends to spread rapidly in that scenario. So the pests have been kind of brought along with hops to that means to spread that rapidly through the yard. So the predators are at a disadvantage. They've got to pick up the pace and get up there faster than they normally do in the conventional side.
Well, which brings me around to one of the main topics I want to talk with you today about, which is how do you actually grow hops at home, and how would an average home brewer interested in growing hops at home get started on that?
Well, obviously you would want to take into account your environment, where you're growing at. It's difficult in certain environments. Obviously, the person growing in the home garden isn't as concerned about maximizing yield.
No.
So the day length issue is less. Whereas we have to make sure we're training just at the right time to make sure we got the right amount of growth when the day length drops and we get flowering. It's not as critical with the home gardener. So the home gardener should choose a plant that is probably less susceptible to disease. So you're going to want a plant that is powdery mildew resistant, or at least very tolerant. And the same with downy mildew, something that's going to tolerate downy mildew, especially in wetter areas.
So what kind of varieties would you look to maybe grow in an average home? Well,
availability is going to be the issue. I would stick with just classic. If I'm going to be growing at home, I would stick with classic varieties that are going to perform relatively well. Some areas, Cascade will do quite well at home, so will Chinook. Other areas, they might have major issues with downy mildew. Nugget can be a good bittering variety for home use. Centennial can be a good variety for home use. So anything that's available, if you're going out and contacting online sellers of rhizomes, anything that's available, could do well. It just depends on where you're at. And I would talk to the person selling the rhizomes to
describe for me for just a minute what an ideal environment might look like.
Well, to me, an ideal environment is something like the Yakima Valley, where it's nice and dry, but you can add water when needed. To me, that's ideal. And you got the right day length, so you're going to be able to maximize production. Now, with that said, in the home garden, you're going to want plenty of sunlight, soil that drains well. I prefer soil slightly on the acidic side, the pH slightly below 7.
Okay.
But hops will grow in a range between 6 and 8. So keep it away from, a lot of people. Hops will naturally in their natural setting will grow with companion plants. So you might see some sort of shrub or brush growing, and hops will be intertwined with that, or around a fence row, anywhere there's structure for them to grow on. You have to provide that structure as well.
So what do you recommend for trellises or something like that? What do you need to grow your hops? Obviously, they grow vertically in a vine, right?
Right. If you're really looking to maximize the number of cones you can obtain off a given plant, I would allow for up to 20 feet of growth. Our standard trellises here in commercial production are 18 foot tall.
Wow!
And most hop varieties have been selected to grow under those conditions. So, if the home gardener wants to maximize the number of cones they're getting from a couple of plants, oftentimes the side of a house is a good way to grow them. If you could string from the eaves of the house down, or if you have the means to build a trellis, pole and wire work structure, as high as they can get it, works well. Now, if it's more a combination of appearance and collecting cones, planting along like a chain link fence tends to work well. Mm-hmm. I have some experimental trellis that I grow plants for temporary purposes that are only 6-7 feet tall, and the hops grow quite well along those. So obviously we would never be able to maximize production at that rate, at that height, but for the home gardener, it can work quite well.
So let's say I go out and purchase some rhizomes from somebody, and I got a trellis and a spot to plant it. What's the next step? What do you, how do you plant them? How deep do they go? How do you water them?
Well, you can be relatively shallow. Mm-hmm. You don't want to plant the rhizomes too deep. They more than likely would survive. If you plant them too deep, you might end up rotting with time, especially if you're in a really wet environment. So plant them fairly shallow, usually in the early spring.
So a few inches.
Yeah, a couple inches deep is all from the top of the rhizome. So your rhizome will be, generally you'll get a rhizome about 6 inches long. And a rhizome is just basically an underground stem is what it is. It's not even a true root. You take that rhizome, and then you plant that down. So you dig your hole, put that in, so the top of the rhizome is maybe only an inch or two below the soil.
And do you wait until after the last frost, or does it matter?
No. Actually, with the rhizome, typically, at least in our environment, we like to plant as early as we can. Sometimes, even in February or March, as soon as we can get out in the field, we'll plant a rhizome. Because that rhizome then will sit, and as the soil starts to warm up and the outside temperature gets warmer, it'll begin to grow at a natural rate and grow through the frost.
So it can handle it, huh?
It can, usually. A real hard frost will knock them back. Now, with that said, if you have a potted plant, something that you're obtaining as a pot, I would suggest then waiting till after the last frost to plant that. But a rhizome's a little bit different, can be handled differently.
And then care of feeding of the hops. Let's say you get them in the ground. What do you do now?
Typically, you've got them in the ground. You're going to want to keep that soil moist. If you could pick that soil up and ball it up in your hand and it stays together, that's a good moisture level. If you're squeezing it and it crumbles right away, you're probably getting a little dry. But if you squeeze it and it's visible, there's maybe water starting to squeeze out of it, you're too wet. So hops, as we like to say, don't like to get their feet wet. They don't like to be sitting in puddles or undrained water. They like good drainage and just kind of an as needed watering.
So, would you recommend using mulch or using, if you're growing at home?
Yeah, absolutely. Mulch works nice for several reasons. Obviously, it conditions the soil over time, and then it also prevents weeds from growing up. So yeah, mulch, a nice mulch, especially after the plant gets established, after it's grown up out of the ground,
right.
Kind of clean up around the base of the plant and kind of mulch around that. That tends to work real nicely.
Gives you a little dry areas, yeah,
right. And where we're at in dry areas, that mulch will kind of retain water in the soil, moisture in the soil around that root without having to water as much.
So how often do you have to water it in say a dry area like Yakima?
Well, dry areas, there's different philosophies. Some people will go with an everyday watering in short sets.
Mm-hmm.
They'll run their drip irrigation in short sets almost on a daily basis. We have a tendency to we'll give a real long watering, say like for 12 or 24 hours, and then shut that water down for another 24, 48 hours to kind of let that soil dry out just a little bit. You don't want to get it bone dry, but allowing that soil to dry out a little bit, we think there's a benefit to that. So I would say, even in the home garden, not much different than most of your garden plants, if you give it a good watering, let the soil drain, let it start to dry a little bit, and then add the water again. So maybe every couple days or something.
So you definitely don't want to keep it too wet, is what you.
No, I don't. I don't like to see the hot plants sitting in too much water. Certain varieties are, they're susceptible to other soil-borne pathogens, and again, that it's very difficult to say one way or the other what those might be. It depends on the area, but you get other diseases like Fusarium and Phytophthora that are, that prefer a wetter condition in the soil, and you can start to get some root rot and other issues.
Now, you mentioned something about training the vines. What is that process you go through? As the thing's growing up, it gets longer and longer. What do you do there?
Right. As they grow up, so what we really, to maximize the production of cones on the plant, what you really want to do is control that growth and what you allow to be put onto your growth structure, on your string, as we call it. So we're, in the commercial yards, we're putting down core yarn or paper twine, depending on availability, and we're putting that down, and then we'll train onto those. Now, if you want to maximize the production, what you do is generally cut back the first flush of growth that comes out. You get these real bullish vines that come out of the ground rapidly. Mm-hmm. Generally, what they're relying on is the reserves of carbohydrates that the root had put down the prior season, and they come out of the ground real rapidly. Generally speaking, we'll cut those back. And when you cut those back is dependent upon where you're at, your day length, and several other factors, so that you can time it just right. For example, we typically, for most of our varieties, starting in, from the first part of May, the month of May really is what time spent training, depending on the variety, we'll go through and wrap those the growing vines onto the string in a clockwise direction at different times of the month. And we'll go through and do that 2 or 3 times to make sure that we get at least two vines per string. And that's typically is what we're targeting. Get 2. We'll actually go and tell the people out training to get as many as 4, but that's under the assumption we might not get all 4 of those going up the string. Mm-hmm. We target 2 to 3 when it's all said and done, and that gives us the generally speaking, the yield that we like to see.
So you say, so basically you take these things, you wrap them clockwise, is what you mentioned? Around the...
Yeah, you wrap them clockwise.
And how long are they when you're doing that? You said May, but roughly what length are we looking at?
Generally speaking, you're going to be about 1.5 feet, 2 feet. So you're looking at maybe an 18-inch vine that you can wrap onto that. Sometimes shorter. You can go as much as a foot, but you don't want to be necessarily forcing it because they won't necessarily take. You want to be able to wrap it on there and have that stay on the string, and not have to keep going back and rewrapping it.
Okay, so you grow these things all season, basically, right? Mm-hmm. You keep watering them, make sure I guess that's all you have to really do is water them and make sure they get plenty of sunlight, right?
Water and fertility. Fertility is critical.
Right. So are you using fertilizer? Or is it something somebody might use at home? Put some potting soil down or something like that? I don't know.
For home use, depending on the intent of the producer, you've got these 2 different issues. If you're looking to grow organically, mm-hmm. Obviously you're going to be a little bit more limited. If you're going conventional, when I talk to gardeners, generally I just suggest a good all-purpose fertilizer. Something like a Miracle Grow or something along those lines.
Plant food or something like that.
Something that's going to have a balanced mix of nutrients. Hops really like nitrogen, so you could supplement maybe with an additional nitrogen application. But typically, a good all-purpose fertilizer that has your macro and micronutrients is going to be a good bet.
So do you do that once when you plant, or do you do that again?
No, I would definitely supplement through the season. Typically, what I do is I would suggest to people is you look at the growth of the plant. Hops are very rapid growers. During that period from when we put it on the string in May through June and into the first part of July, everything that's coming up is vegetative growth. And at that time, it's going to grow, under ideal conditions, a hop plant will grow a foot a day.
Wow.
And so it's through the month, through May and in the first part of June, it's relying primarily on its carbohydrate reserves in the root. But after that, it has to convert to what it's getting from the soil. So in that May-June period is a good time to supplement with nitrogen because that's really what it's going to be using up. As the soil, well, I guess let's back up a step.
Yeah.
As the soil warms up in the spring, that's a good time to be applying like your phosphorus and other nutrients to have that bank there for the plant when it's ready to start using it up. And you have a little bit of nitrogen at that time as well. And then as that plant starts to grow rapidly and you get into that peak of growth and in that June, July period, supplement at that time with maybe a couple of applications of nitrogen. It can be light applications of nitrogen at that time, but it's going to need something to supplement it, especially after that plant's been in the ground. First year, second year, it might not be a big deal, but as you get further down the road, years in advance, that root is going to be mining that soil and taking a lot out of it. And then when you get into the flowering period, you can begin applying some other chemicals to supplement that. So it's almost like any other plant. You just look at that stages of growth and fertilize accordingly. But if you want to keep it simple, an all-purpose fertilizer, maybe 2 or 3 times during the summer, it would probably be a good bet.
So at some point during the summer, the hop cones actually start to pop up, right?
Yep. As the day length starts to shorten in July, typically is when that happens. Once you get down there below 16 hours of day length, the signal for the plant to flower is there. So that's a photo period response. And typically, around here, we're looking in the latter half of July is when that really kicks in. So
let's say you're doing this at home. How do you then decide, it's time to harvest? How do you know?
Well, there's going to be about a month period between flowering and when it's probably ready for harvest. You'll notice the initial, flowers popping out and what we call the initial bloom and the initial burr. And those are what develop into the actual cones. Mm-hmm. So you watch those develop, and you get down to, depending on the variety, you get down towards the end of August typically. Mm-hmm. And that's when things will start to really develop, and those cones will take on a different feel. When they're immature, if you could feel them out in the field, they'll have a real soft feeling. You could squeeze them in your hands, and they'll feel real lot of moisture in them, a lot of water. You can actually squeeze the water out of them at times. Yep. So there'd be a lot of water in them. And then what needs to happen is that cone will continue to develop in size, and actually as the plant matures through the season, the roots will begin taking it's a whole source sink relationship in plants and a perennial plant, that the leaves and everything above ground will then begin supplying the nutrients back to the hop plant or to the roots mm-hmm. for the next season. So the cones themselves are part of that interaction, and so as they begin to develop, they'll begin to lose moisture and gain in size, and the result is an increase in dry matter. And we typically target about 25% for all intents and purposes, 25% dry matter at harvest. So that means 75% of that cone is water, and the rest is dry matter, and that usually indicates a rough indication of maturity. Now,
so what does that feel like? I mean, let's say we're trying to judge it at home.
Much more papery feel than earlier on. Earlier on, like I said, it has that real soft, watery feel to it. Mm-hmm. As it gets mature, one way you could tell is if you could put that cone lengthways in between your index and thumb mm-hmm. and squeeze down. Typically, the strig, which is the central axis in the cone. If you tear a hop cone apart, it's made up of the bracts and bracteoles, which are the petals, and then a central axis, which is the strig. Mm-hmm. If you squeeze lengthways and that strig breaks, that's usually a pretty good indication that you're getting drier. Otherwise, if it's sweat, it'll just fold over with the rest of the cone.
I see.
And now, with that said, another indicator is, of course, the aroma. The ultimate thing we're looking for, there's a difference between crop maturity and physiological maturity. Physiological maturity would be at the end of harvest, and typically that cone is really just meant as a package to carry that seed and get the seed, the progeny from that plant, distributed. So physiological maturity isn't until the end of September, maybe even into October. But crop maturity is different. What we're really looking for is the lupulin glands, which are tiny little sacs, that are within that cone. Those contain the oils and the acids that we typically associate with aroma and flavor for beer. And so if we're maximizing maturity, you're going to wait until those glands have completely filled, and you've maximized the oil content as well as the resin content, the alphas and betas.
So let's say you get to that point and you've decided you want to harvest the cones now. What's the process you go through then?
Well, if we're talking commercial,
maybe describe it on a commercial scale first, and then we'll talk about maybe what some of the home alternatives might be.
Right. So as explaining a commercial operation, what we've done, we started out in the spring tying down all these strings to our 18-foot trellis, and the plants had grown up those, and they're up and over the wire. So we've got these 18-foot long vines growing throughout the field. So what we do is we'll go through first, cut the bottoms about 3 feet off the ground, and with what we call bottom cutters, just a tractor with sickle blades on the front.
Mm-hmm.
That goes through, cuts the bottoms. Truck is then pushed through the field by what we call the top cutter, which is then cutting the vines at the top. And those vines fall into a truck, and they're brought to a stationary hop picking machine, which varies a little bit from farm to farm, but the same general principle is you're taking those vines, stripping all the leaves and cones and everything off of them, and then the machinery is meant to separate just the cones from everything else.
Right.
And so it's a very mechanized process at this point for the commercial hop grower. Without the mechanization, we couldn't do it.
Right.
At one time they were all hand picked, but that's a very, very labor intensive process. In fact, my great grandfather, when he was my great grandfather, when he first started farming hops, he had about 13 acres is all, and he had to employ about 100 people.
Wow.
And it took him 30 days to get the 13 acres.
Wow.
So gives you an idea. So the mechanization is critical. And so that machine then will separate the cones from everything else and send those into a large commercial drying operation that we just call the kiln. They go into the kiln and they dry for 8 to 12 hours in there, down to about 10% moisture. That's what we target. And those cones are then piled into large piles to equilibrate, so that the moisture in the pile and the temperature and everything equilibrates. We mix them up. It mixes them up pretty good so that there's no wet pockets or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're baled into 200-pound bales.
Wow.
So that's the quick overview of the commercial harvest. Now, for the home gardener, what you're want to do is when you determine that you've reached maturity, is to simply hand pick the cones.
Right.
And typically, like for the breeding program, we used to pick by hand prior to getting a small experimental scale harvester, and typically it would take about 2 hours or so to pick a single plant. So it's pretty labor intensive. It takes a while.
So you pick the cones, and obviously you got to dry them somehow. You have a good. Right. How would you go about doing that at home?
That's the big problem for the home hop grower, is how do we get these things dried down, because that's really a critical control point in terms of quality. So question is, well, what's the best way to do it? And I get asked that quite a bit, and the best way obviously is something like a food dehydrator. If you don't have very many cones, you could take just your typical food dehydrator, mm-hmm. and dry them down to 10% moisture, roughly.
You can buy one of those relatively cheaply. Yeah.
Right.
Same thing you would use to dehydrate fruit or something like that, right?
Right. Yep. Now, if you're a little bit larger scale in your home endeavor, if you're real aggressive with it, then you're going to need something else. And there's a number of different things you can build. Just a box that's blowing, warm air through the cones. If you've got the time, you can just blow ambient air through it. It'll dry them down. It just takes much longer. The critical thing, in my opinion, is you do want the air moving though. You don't want to just set them out to dry. You want to get some air movement through there, and especially if you're using the warm air, because that gives you the evaporative cooling effect, or the evaporative effect, rather than just heating them up, and cooking them.
Well, if I understand it, heat and light is kind of an enemy of hops, right?
It is. And even the cooler you can dry them, the better. On a commercial scale, we have to take into account several factors. That being, for example, the amount of time they're sitting in the kiln. We can't have them in there too long because we'll fill our kilns up and we got to shut down picking, and it doesn't work out real well for us. So there's an efficiency issue we have to deal with. Mm-hmm. In a perfect world, I would say, we typically, like commercially on our Aroma hops, we don't dry it at temperatures over 130 degrees. And I would say that's probably, my suggestion would be the max that you'd want to see. Otherwise you're getting your oils volatilized and you're losing some of that in that process. If you can go lower than that, that's great. And on a commercial scale, when we can, we do dry low at a lower temp, but it's difficult, when you're trying to harvest that much volume.
So you're going to dry them down to I can't remember the moisture content you're shooting
about
for.
10% moisture, 10% moisture.
Similar to what we do with grain, actually, about 10%.
Yeah.
And then what do you do with it? What's the hop storage routine say for?
Well, from a commercial standpoint, we're taking those hops directly from the bale into cold storage. Cold storage being 27, 29 degrees, so just below freezing. From a home gardener standpoint, somebody and the hops will store for quite a while at that temperature, but they will degrade even at 27 to 29 degrees. So typically, what we'll do is we'll pelletize them as quickly as possible, get them in the foils and flushed and vacuum sealed. Obviously, the home gardener isn't going to have necessarily that luxury. My suggestion, and we do this with the breeding program where we're doing small scale samples, is to get them dried down. And if you can, vacuum sealed, just something like a food saver or something along those lines.
I know you can get barrier bags, if you shop around for them. Yeah. Right.
Something along those lines. And then if you have room in a freezer, an actual deep freeze, that's great. Hops actually store quite well.
Yeah, I store all mine in the freezer. I think most homebrewers do these days.
Yep. And so that would be my suggested route of storage because typically even after a year they're still in great shape. So.
Well, I thought I'd finish with a couple questions about your business here. What are some of your favorite hop varieties to use? I assume you brew some beer yourself, right?
Yeah, do a little bit of that. I leave most of that to the experts, though. There's so many beers out there. I like trying them all. So, my favorite varieties. I'm a little bit biased, I got to admit, because as part of as a hop breeder and being involved in the development of hops like Simcoe and Tannum and Citra and now Mosaic and Palisade and a few others, I'm a little bit biased towards those, obviously, and for good reason too, though. Not just the fact that we're involved.
What are some of the advantages of those hops, for example?
Well, I think that the flavor you get if you're obviously like a hop forward beer lover, like an IPA lover or pale ale, like myself, then the flavors that those hops give, as opposed to some of the more traditional varieties, I just really enjoy that. That's from a beer drinking standpoint. From a growing standpoint, they're also pretty nice to grow. They're good hops. Most of those were selected here in our environment, which versus you take your traditional European landrace varieties such as Zatz, Tettnanger, Hallertau. Yeah, those hops were selected. They were selected in a much different environment. So you bring them here in the Yakima Valley and try to grow them, and it can be very difficult, to say the least, to get an economic yield. Whereas these varieties, these newer, these kind of new world hops are more adapted to this environment, and they grow quite well, and we have less of a challenge with them. So
which hops do you actually sell the most of?
Right now, we sell the most of Simcoe from our farm. We're one of only 6 farms in the U.S. that grows Simcoe. One of the original farms that grows Simcoe. So in fact, we had one of the original commercial plantings
I don't think it's quite as widely available in the home brewing market as it is in the commercial market.
No, I don't think so, because it's highly sought after.
Right.
Year in, year out, we're increasing the acreage, by 100% plus, trying to keep up with demand.
Yeah, home brewers tend to be at the tail end of the supply chain there, so we take whatever hasn't been used by the big guys, I guess.
Yeah, well, hopefully, we can begin to get that changed as we learn to manage these and match up that demand. But definitely, I think going forward, if you look at the amount of increase in acreage for some of these varieties like Simcoe and Citra, it's so rapid that at some point we are going to reach that point where there's going to be plenty available to all.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you have any tips for homebrewers?
With regard to, it's kind of a broad question.
Well, I mean, just in terms of using hops or brewing with hops or storing hops, almost anything.
Oh, I guess just like anything else, my only suggestion would be to think outside the box, and when you can use these new varieties, try them out, and one of the things that we've done in the past is just found a recipe that we like that, just do a single hop test and see how these different experimentals work, and hopefully I have some thoughts in my head going forward that we can begin to get some of these experimentals out to the homebrew side of things, maybe even before we get them out to the commercial side, as kind of a test market, so to speak. And so anytime that you can see something new available, to grab it up and give it a try.
Yeah, I'd certainly support that.
Yeah.
Was there anything else you'd like to add, Jason?
No, I think that's it. That's about it. I just my suggestion I guess the only other suggestion I'd have to both home brewers and anybody else who's brewing beers, use more hops. Use as many as possible.
Use as many as possible.
So,
well, thank you. I really appreciate you being on the show, Jason. Thanks again.
All right, thanks for having me.
I know you've been very busy, but thank you for taking the time.
Busy's good, so that's a good thing. Thanks for having me.
So again, my guest is Jason Perrault from Perrault Farms, a family-run business in Yakima Valley, established in 1902. Well, I'd like to thank Jason Perrault for doing that great interview. I hope you learned a little bit more about hops. I'd like to remind you again to visit BeerSmithRecipes.com, our new recipe site, as well as download the new version of BeerSmith, BeerSmith 2.1 at BeerSmith.com. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.